Well, that's right, Sam. We are back in the classroom, and I'm joined by my friend Joe Cornwall. Joe, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, we're going to talk a little bit today about HDMI and maybe some different protocols in the industry. I think we're all pretty familiar with an HDMI cable, but are we really, right? So we have started this last couple of years with the 2.0 standard and then the 2.1 standard. Now we're talking 2.2, but I want to ask at a high level, what are some of the differences that people can expect to see between 2.1 and 2.2?
It is critical, and really we need to ask, what is the difference between 2.0 and 2.1 first, right? So if we go back to 2.0, which had 18 gigabits per second and allowed us to do 4K at 60, this was an amazing thing. And frankly, this is pretty much where our industry sits today. So we go a couple of years ago, and we ended up with HDMI 2.1. The thing that I think a lot of people didn't get was that it was a wholesale change. We dropped this thing called TMDS, Transition Minimized Differential Signaling, and went to something called a fixed rate link, which allowed us to go from 18 gigabits per second to this amazing 48 gigabits per second. And right now, today, on the floor here at the Infocom show, we're seeing some manufacturers that are now having devices that will allow for ingest of 2.1. So much, much wider bandwidth. Well, why do we need 2.1? Why do we need this giant bandwidth? Things like virtual reality, augmented reality, larger bandwidths. And I'm not just talking about pixel numbers, but things like high dynamic range require much more extended bandwidth and really improve the viewing concept. So now we go to this HDMI 2.2. It is 6 months old. It didn't exist before January of this year. It was ratified, it was brought out in CES. And here's the big difference. We used an extended fixed rate link. So now we're going from 48 gigabits per second to a breathtaking 96 gigabits per second. Now, this is far beyond anything any LAN can handle, but what's interesting is it brings it up so that it is now equivalent to DisplayPort as well. And with HDMI 2.2, there's a couple of features that were added that I thought was pretty interesting in addition to this extended fixed rate link, which does give us this bandwidth capability. The first one is it has this ability to have latency indication protocol. If you ask me, this is voodoo, okay? Because here's what it is. And by the way, everything to do HDMI 2.1 must be 2.1. Everything to do HDMI 2.2 must be 2.2. So you're designing a system that is at itself, while it's backwards compatible with 2.0, is completely a different beast. And what we're doing with this capability, the latency index capability, is the devices that are associated with these products with HDMI 2.2 will report their inherent latency to a controller, thereby allowing the system to automatically guarantee that we have sound sync with video no matter where we are. And think of how important that is for a virtual reality type application. So 96 gigabits per second and basically refined. We've entered an entirely new age for HDMI, and it is not your father's HDMI.
Well, look, your bandwidth requirements aren't going down anytime soon, right? They continue to double, triple, quadruple year over year, it feels like. But I'm curious, Joe, I know we've got some integrators asking, do I need to go and just rebuild the systems? Do I need to recable everything? What would you say to people who might say, hey, do I actually need to go back and rebuild my stuff?
So that's a great question. And it really comes down to just taking the temperature of what the system is going to be used for and where it's going to be. Keep in mind that link length is inversely proportional to link bandwidth, okay? So if we're talking about 96 gigabits per second, you're not running this 100 feet, nor do you need to. But if the room is going to require the use of virtual reality, which could be very common in, let's say, medical applications where I'm doing some things like that, in educational applications where I'm doing some things like that, or just for entertainment, if we feel that we're going to have that kind of an installation, then we should be looking at 2.2 to begin with. And yes, the answer is, you require all new links. And by the way, this is not going to be easily routable over any kind of a network. Once again, 96 gigabits per second, even with the display stream compression, we're just not going to make that happen. And you're absolutely right. We're not going to see bandwidths come down in the same way that we're not going to see $1.99 Happy Meals anymore. Everything is getting bigger, everything is getting more intense. And that includes when we start looking at the audiovisual community, because we're dealing with such an incredible amount of information coming across to create these images that we almost take for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, you're at home watching 4K HDR at 4 megabits per second from a Netflix stream in Dolby Atmos, and we walk into a conference room and we go, why does that look worse than my smartphone? Why can I do things at home that I can't do here? And I think that's part of it, is our industry has got to take that next step and realize we need to be progressive and on the edge of it. So look at what your clients are going to do, not the day you commission the system, but ask them how they intend that space to be used 5 years or 2 years or a year after they commission that system, and wire accordingly, because otherwise you're pulling that out and putting in new cables, and who really wants to volunteer for that?
Joe, if we haven't made everybody's head spin yet, I'm going to toss you one more question.
Absolutely.
We're talking HDMI, obviously, but there's plenty of other protocols out there, including GPMI. Can you give us just a quick tease about what that looks like?
GPMI. GPMI is one of these things that it was like getting a sledgehammer to the forehead when I first heard about this. Like, my God, they're not really doing this.
Wonderful.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely, it was both a headache and an enlightening moment of clarity. And the reality is GPMI is something that is being created by an association of about 50 Chinese manufacturers. Many of them are here on the floor, right? A lot of the display manufacturers, these are not small companies. These are giant corporations, and they represent a huge amount of our product. And they're bringing out GPMI because they want something that's more flexible than HDMI. So it's general purpose media interface. That's what GPMI is all about. Once again, 50 companies that are very influential, that are exhibiting here on the floor, are working together to bring this out. It uses a lot of very interesting techniques of the way that it handles the data, but it also is very interesting in what it can do both in terms of power and what it can do in terms of bandwidth.
Well, Joe, I'm going to ask you about that. We're actually going to hang on to you and bring you back next show as well to talk deeper into that world as well.
Absolutely.
So Joe, thanks for coming on the first show here at Avixa TV Live this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.